A routine stop on a Wednesday night suddenly turns into a battle for justice as Lieutenant Colonel Robert Harrison faces off against Sergeant Thomas Ward, an experienced officer determined to assert his power. As tensions rise, Robert's patience sparks a chain of events that challenge the very foundations of power, responsibility, and respect. Will the system uphold the truth, or will badge-wearing officers remain untouchable? Before diving into this gripping story of courage, integrity, and fighting for what's right today, let us know where you're from in the world. It was a Wednesday night, just past 11 p.m., when Lieutenant Colonel Robert Harrison found himself driving through the quiet streets of a small town in Ohio. The world outside his car was empty, save for a few late-night shift workers heading home or the occasional tired soul out for a solitary drive. The only sound was the low hum of his SUV's engine and the rhythmic roll of tires against the pavement. He had been on the road for hours, attending a long meeting a couple of hours south, and now he just wanted to head home. His mind was already halfway there, thinking about the warmth of his bed, the comfort of home, the quiet night that awaited him. As he cruised through the calm town, there was nothing about his driving that suggested anything unusual. He wasn't speeding, weaving, or swerving. His focus was steady. He was driving a government-issued black SUV, not flashy, not drawing attention. It was a simple car, clean, practical, just like him. The only hint of something out of place came when Sergeant Thomas Ward, a seasoned officer with 16 years on the force, sat in his usual spot by the side of Reynolds Road. He had been there for a while, his shift dragging on with little action, no calls, no real incidents. He sipped his lukewarm coffee, scrolling mindlessly through his phone, looking for something, anything, to break the monotony of a quiet night. And then he saw it, the unfamiliar black SUV gliding down the road. Something in him stirred, and without thinking, he flipped on the siren. The lights flashed bright and intrusive, and before Robert could even register what was happening, he slowed and pulled over to the side of the road. There was nothing remarkable about it at first, just a simple stop, a routine moment in time, a soldier on his way home. But for Robert, it was about to become something far more significant, something that would change the course of his life in ways he couldn't yet understand. Sergeant Thomas Ward's cruiser came to a slow stop behind Robert's SUV, the hum of the engine louder in the stillness of the night. Robert sat in the driver's seat, his hands resting calmly on the wheel, his posture relaxed, his mind still focused on the quiet evening ahead. He had done nothing wrong, nothing to warrant the attention of the officer now approaching his vehicle. Yet as the door of the patrol car slammed shut, he felt a small knot of unease tighten in his stomach. Sergeant Ward walked toward him, his boots echoing on the asphalt. The officer's steps were deliberate, his hand already resting on his holster, a sign of readiness. No friendly greeting, no acknowledgement. Just a man with authority and an air of impatience. Robert kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, the way he had been trained. He didn't flinch. He didn't panic. Instead, he quietly rolled down the window, meeting Ward's gaze with a steady, unwavering look. "License and registration," the officer barked, his voice sharp, authoritative, almost dismissive. There was no pleasantry, no acknowledgement of Robert's military rank, just a demand. Robert, always composed in the face of adversity, asked calmly, "Officer, may I ask why I'm being stopped?" Ward's gaze shifted, his face hardening, but there was something almost mechanical about his response. "You were drifting between lanes," Ward said. His eyes narrowed, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. "You didn't signal, and it looked like you might have been under the influence." Robert raised an eyebrow, slightly taken aback. He had been driving steadily, no swerving, no reckless behavior. "I wasn't," Robert replied evenly. "Not defensive, just firm." But Ward was already losing patience. "License and registration," he repeated, his tone louder now, as if to assert his power. Robert, still calm, complied, reaching for his documents. He handed them over, without a word. His fingers deliberate, steady. "That's a government vehicle," he said, his voice not a challenge, but a simple statement of fact. "I'm a federal employee." Ward glanced down at the ID, then up at Robert. For a brief moment, there was silence, a slight shift in the officer's demeanor, but it didn't last long. "Military?" Ward asked, his voice laced with a faint hint of mockery. Robert nodded, but didn't elaborate. "Doesn't mean you're above the law," Ward muttered, his eyes hardening again. "I never said I was," Robert responded, his voice quiet but unwavering. It wasn't an argument. It was just truth. But Ward was too far gone, too deep in his need to assert control. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered abruptly. Robert blinked, confused for a moment. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone still calm, still controlled. "Step out of the car," Ward repeated, louder now, his posture shifting slightly as if preparing for confrontation. "I'm conducting a sobriety check." Robert's jaw tightened, but he remained calm, measured. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice firm but not confrontational. "I've complied with everything. I haven't been drinking." Ward didn't answer. He simply stood there, his eyes narrowing, clearly not interested in any further discussion. He was fixated on his authority, unwilling to let go of the power he believed he had in that moment. Without warning, he opened Robert's car door himself, pushing past the boundaries of civility. "I need you to exit the vehicle," he commanded. In that moment, Robert knew this was no longer just a routine stop. This was about something bigger, something personal, something driven by ego and pride. And yet, Robert didn't resist. He didn't argue. Instead, he quietly turned on his phone camera, his fingers steady as he hit record. "Just so we're clear," he said, his voice calm, the words measured. "This interaction is being documented." Ward hesitated for just a second, his eyes flicking to the phone. But the brief moment of uncertainty didn't last. Instead, he took another step forward, his ego flaring. "Out of the car," he demanded again. Robert, still composed, knew that this was no longer about right or wrong. It was about power. But he wouldn't let Ward take control. Not without a fight. Robert felt the weight of the officer's demand hanging in the air, and for a moment, the quiet night seemed to stretch on forever. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took a slow breath and made the quiet, deliberate decision to stay calm. His hand, still steady on the door handle, reached for his phone. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but he knew this was a moment that demanded documentation. His fingers brushed the screen, turning on the camera with the subtle motion of someone who had long ago learned the value of caution in moments like these. "Just so we're clear," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This interaction is being documented." The words hung in the air, a quiet assertion of his resolve. Sergeant Ward's eyes flickered briefly to the phone, a momentary hesitation flashing across his face before it was quickly masked by the same hardened expression. It was as if the officer was trying to convince himself that he could continue, that he could win this small battle for dominance. But Robert's quiet resistance had planted a seed of doubt. It wasn't enough to deter Ward. He had come this far, and the last thing he would do was back down now. "Out of the car," Ward repeated, his voice now more insistent, more demanding, but still not a hint of genuine reason in it. Robert, standing his ground, pushed the door open slightly, stepped out with a calm that felt almost unnerving. The cool night air hit him as he stood on the pavement, his posture straight, shoulders back. He didn't move with the belligerence of a man ready for a confrontation. He moved like a soldier who had been trained in the art of self-control, a man who understood the value of calm in the face of chaos. Ward looked him up and down, his eyes narrowing. He sized Robert up, trying to gauge what he was dealing with. The officer's stance was still aggressive, but for the first time, doubt crept in. Robert wasn't responding in the way he expected. He wasn't cowering, wasn't fighting back, wasn't even raising his voice. Ward was used to people either folding under his authority or escalating the situation. But Robert Harrison wasn't like the others. The officer's hand still rested near his holster, and there was a brief moment where Robert could see the tension in Ward's shoulders, the slight tremble in his hand as it hovered near the weapon. Ward gestured to the side of the road, his voice snapping out as he barked, "Walk the line!" It was a field sobriety test, but Robert wasn't drunk, wasn't swaying, wasn't even remotely impaired. He stepped forward, his military training kicking in as he walked with measured precision. He walked the line as though it was just another drill, a simple exercise, passing each step with the exacting discipline that had been ingrained in him over years of service. No stumble, no hesitation, nothing out of place. Ward stood there, watching, his eyes flickering with something that might have been frustration or disbelief. Robert didn't give him the satisfaction of an argument, didn't give him the moment of triumph that Ward had been expecting. The test was over in a matter of seconds, and Robert passed. But it wasn't enough for Ward. The officer wasn't done. He didn't back down. Instead, he wrote Robert a citation for a minor traffic violation, failure to maintain his lane. It didn't matter that Robert had passed the sobriety test. Didn't matter that the officer had no real cause for suspicion. Ward, in his mind, had already made his decision, and Robert's calm, measured response had only solidified it. Robert took the ticket without a word, his gaze steady but resolute. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply accepted it, a silent acknowledgement that the situation was over for now. But as he climbed back into his SUV and pulled away into the darkness of the night, something shifted inside him. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. It wasn't just about a ticket. It was about something deeper, something that Robert had lived with for years but had never had to confront so directly. This moment, quiet as it was was a line in the sand, a point of no return. And Robert knew that it wasn't over yet. The next few days passed in a strange kind of silence for both men. Robert returned to his routine, the hum of his SUV once again, a comfort on the long drives back to base. But his mind kept returning to that moment on the side of the road. He couldn't shake the feeling of powerlessness that had washed over him in that brief encounter with Sergeant Ward. It wasn't the ticket that troubled him. He could accept a minor infraction without complaint. It wasn't even the officer's dismissive attitude toward his rank. It was the way Ward had behaved, the way he had wielded his authority like a weapon, not to serve or protect, but to assert dominance. It was the realization that power, when unchecked, could be so easily abused. Ward, on the other hand, thought the matter was closed. He'd written the ticket. He'd done his job. He hadn't arrested Robert, hadn't made a scene. As far as he was concerned, it was just another day. But Robert wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when it felt like something was deeply wrong. He didn't speak of it to anyone at first. He was methodical in his approach. The morning after the stop, while the events were still fresh in his mind, Robert made a few calls. He contacted his legal team, quietly explaining the details of the stop. He filed a formal complaint with the Internal Affairs Division, sending the footage he had recorded along with it. He also reached out to the Inspector General's office, knowing that this wasn't just about him, but about the larger issue of unchecked authority and what could happen when someone in power wasn't held accountable. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want media attention. He just wanted the truth to be acknowledged, wanted Ward to face the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Sergeant Ward remained blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing behind him. He had gone back to the station, logged the ticket, and tossed the body cam footage into the charging dock like he always did. It wasn't until 2 days later, when his fellow officers began to talk about the stop in hushed tones, that Ward realized something was amiss. Officer Diaz had been the first to ask about it, his voice tinged with curiosity. "She's military?" he asked, his brow furrowed as Ward casually mentioned the woman's name, Robert Harrison. "Lieutenant Colonel," Ward answered dismissively. "Big deal. She tried to pull rank on me, but I showed her who's in charge." But Diaz didn't respond the way Ward expected. Instead, he hesitated, his face shifting slightly. "Lieutenant Colonel Wallace?" he asked, slowly. "The one who runs logistics out of Fort Wayne? She gave a lecture at the academy last year, didn't she?" Ward paused. He had heard of Wallace, of course, but he hadn't connected the name to the woman in the SUV. He shrugged it off. "So what? Doesn't mean she's above the law." But Diaz's tone had changed, now laced with something like respect. "That woman's got 2 tours overseas. She's got a Bronze Star, man. She's legit." Ward, irritated at the implication that he had done something wrong, waved it off. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "I'm the one pulling people over, not her." But something about Diaz's caution stuck with him. There was a seed of doubt that had been planted, but Ward refused to acknowledge it. Instead, he continued to carry on with his routine, convinced the whole situation would blow over. He didn't think about the footage. He didn't think about the complaint that Robert had quietly filed. For him, the incident was over. But in reality, it had only just begun. As the days passed, the situation began to gain more traction. Robert's complaint had been taken seriously and quietly. The wheels of justice were turning. Robert wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't looking to make an example of anyone, but he couldn't let Ward's abuse of power go unnoticed. Not when it had been so clear that Ward had treated him differently, disrespectfully, simply because of his military background. Robert wasn't a victim, but in that moment, he realized the system that had protected Sergeant Ward for so long had failed, and that, in the end, was the real injustice. The days after Robert filed his complaint seemed to stretch on endlessly. At first, there was a quiet sense of disbelief as Sergeant Ward went about his routine, still confident that the situation was behind him, that his actions would never be scrutinized. But Robert knew better. He wasn't interested in causing a spectacle, in turning this into a media frenzy. His goal was accountability, a word that Ward, in his arrogance, seemed to have forgotten. The internal review had begun behind closed doors, a quiet ripple in the calm surface of the police department's routine. Robert's legal team worked diligently, sifting through the evidence, making sure everything was in order. The footage was clear, undeniable. There was no argument, no exaggeration. The video spoke for itself, showing Ward's disregard for protocol, his eagerness to escalate the situation based on nothing more than a fleeting sense of power. Meanwhile, Sergeant Ward carried on, unaware that the world around him was starting to shift. He had become a punchline among his fellow officers. "The Fed who wouldn't back down," they whispered, a sense of mockery creeping into the conversations. Ward, still convinced of his invincibility, didn't pay much attention. The whispers didn't faze him. What did concern him, however, was the growing sense of discomfort he felt every time the subject came up in the break room. His colleagues' glances, the slight shifts in their posture, they made him uneasy. He laughed it off, convinced that once the dust settled, everything would return to normal. But it didn't. 3 days after the initial complaint, the envelope arrived at Ward's desk, simple and unassuming, the weight of it heavy in his hands. He tore it open with a sense of dread creeping up his spine, his eyes scanning the contents. The words hit him like a cold wave. "You are required to appear before a civil court to respond to a formal civil rights complaint filed against you by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Harrison." The reality of it began to sink in, slowly, as Ward's mind struggled to process what he was reading. This wasn't just a departmental reprimand. This was a legal matter, a challenge to his authority that could unravel everything he had built over his 15 years in law enforcement. Ward stood there in stunned silence, the envelope still in his hand, his mind racing. His career, his reputation, all of it was suddenly on the line. And for what? For a traffic stop that he had convinced himself was justified, for an officer's instinct that had, in hindsight, been terribly wrong. His initial reaction was to dismiss it. "It's just a legal formality," he thought. "Nothing will come of this. I'm a cop. I've been doing this for years. I know how to handle myself." But there was a nagging doubt now, something he couldn't shake. He couldn't ignore the fact that Robert Harrison was no ordinary citizen. He wasn't just some disgruntled motorist. He was a seasoned military officer with a spotless record, someone whose experience and discipline were beyond reproach. And now, this was going to court. It wasn't just about a mistake anymore. It was about a system that had failed to protect the people it was meant to serve. Ward found himself pacing, his mind circling the same thoughts over and over. What had I missed? What had I done wrong? But no answers came. Instead, there was only a growing sense of dread that clung to him, as if the very walls of the station were closing in. In the meantime, Robert continued to live his life, his focus unwavering. He didn't want revenge. He wasn't seeking to ruin anyone's career, but he knew this was a fight that needed to be fought. It was about more than just him. It was about making sure that those who wore the badge were held accountable, that their actions, their power, didn't go unchecked. And as the day of the court hearing drew closer, Robert's resolve only grew stronger. The quiet strength of his conviction was what made him different from the others. He knew the stakes. He knew that this wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about something far larger, the kind of justice that didn't come easily but had to be fought for. The day of the verdict arrived with an unexpected heaviness in the air. For Robert, it was the culmination of a quiet battle he had waged in his own way, calm, measured, and with an unwavering sense of right. As he walked into the courtroom that day, he didn't carry the weight of expectation on his shoulders. He had never wanted this to become a spectacle. His goal had always been simple: accountability. The courtroom was full, but the tension in the air was thick with anticipation. Reporters had not yet arrived in full force, but there were murmurs in the room, whispers about the case that had begun to stir interest. The members of the local police department sat in the back, some familiar faces that had worked with Sergeant Ward for years. They knew him. They respected him. But the look in their eyes had changed in the past few days. It was subtle, but Robert could feel it. A shift, a hesitation, an unease about the man who had been so untouchable just weeks ago. Sergeant Ward sat stiffly at the defense table, his face blank, but his eyes were tense, darting from the judge to the witnesses. He wasn't used to being the one who was scrutinized, the one who had to answer for his actions. He had spent his entire career thinking that his badge would shield him, that no one would question his authority. But now, in this courtroom, everything had changed. The judge's voice cut through the silence, delivering the verdict with a sense of finality that sent a ripple through the room. In the matter of Robert Harrison versus Thomas Ward, the jury has found in favor of the plaintiff, the judge announced, and Robert felt a quiet relief wash over him. There was no applause, no victory speech, no moment of fanfare. The truth had been laid bare, and that was all Robert had wanted. The decision was a moment of justice, not a personal triumph. The judge continued, outlining the details of the ruling. Sergeant Ward's actions during the traffic stop on January 17th were found to violate the plaintiff's constitutional rights. Furthermore, the actions taken by Officer Ward were not in alignment with basic departmental policies or professional conduct. Robert stood still as the words echoed in his ears. It wasn't the judgment itself that mattered most to him. It was the fact that the system, which had so often protected those like Sergeant Ward, had been forced to acknowledge the abuse of power. Ward's attorney leaned over to whisper, "We'll appeal." But it was clear that even he wasn't certain the appeal would be successful. The room fell into a stunned silence as the judge continued. Though no criminal charges will be filed at this time, the plaintiff is entitled to damages totaling $35,000, and this case will remain on public record. The ruling will be forwarded to the Toledo Police Department for internal review and policy evaluation. The word stung, not for the money. Robert had never asked for any financial compensation, but for the fact that the department's actions would now be under scrutiny. This was a beginning, not an end. Sergeant Ward sat in his chair, shoulders slumped as the weight of the verdict settled on him. The arrogance that had once defined him had crumbled, replaced by a palpable sense of defeat. Outside the courtroom, reporters had started to gather, their cameras flashing as they caught sight of Ward. The man who had once been untouchable was now the subject of ridicule and public scrutiny. Robert didn't stay for the media circus that followed. He didn't need to. His job was done. The system had finally been forced to face the truth. As he left the courthouse, his steps were steady, not triumphant, but sure. He knew that accountability wasn't about seeking revenge. It was about ensuring that the wrongs were corrected, that no one else would have to face what he had faced that night on the side of the road. For Robert, it was enough. The fight had been quiet, but it had been meaningful. And as for Sergeant Ward, his world had shifted in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The walls that had once protected him were now crumbling, and he would never again walk the streets with the same sense of invincibility. But Robert, for his part, moved on. He had always known that the real victory wasn't in the judgment. It was in the change it would bring. Weeks passed since the verdict, but for Robert, the weight of the moment never truly left him. He returned to his duties, his life carrying on in the same quiet discipline that had always defined him. He didn't need accolades or recognition. The real work was still ahead. He had won in court, but the change he sought wasn't just about one officer's downfall. It was about creating a lasting shift in how authority was exercised, how those in power treated others. The true victory, he knew, was in the impact he could have on those who would follow in his footsteps, those who would one day wear the same uniform he had worn. That morning, Robert stood before a group of new recruits at Fort Wayne, a room filled with young faces eager to serve, eager to make a difference. He wasn't there to talk about tactics or strategy, not this time. Today, he was there to talk about leadership, about integrity, and about the kind of responsibility that came with wearing a uniform. He looked around the room, his gaze steady as he asked them, "How many of you think a uniform automatically earns you respect?" A few hands went up, some hesitant, some certain, but the room fell into a quiet pause as Robert let the silence stretch. "I understand why you'd think that," he continued, his voice calm but strong. "But here's the truth. Respect isn't something you're owed. It's something you prove every day, with every choice." He paused again, letting the words settle before adding, "Same goes for power. The badge, the rank, the authority, it's not a shield, it's a weight. And if you can't carry it with discipline, you don't deserve to carry it at all." Robert's words echoed in the room, and as he continued speaking, the silence grew deeper. Not from disinterest, but from understanding. They were hearing something that would stay with them long after they left the room. "When I was stopped by an officer who forgot that truth," he said, his voice steady, "I could have yelled, I could have panicked, I could have let it slide. But I didn't. I documented it. I filed. I showed up in court, and I told the truth. That officer thought his badge made him untouchable, until he saw my rank. But it wasn't just about my uniform. It was about how I carried myself. The room was still now, not a sound except for the soft shuffle of paper, the quiet stir of realization settling in. Leadership, Robert continued, his voice resonating with conviction, isn't about power. It's about character. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. As he finished, he closed the folder in front of him, a quiet nod to himself. He had done what he set out to do. The recruits would carry his lesson with them, and though he didn't expect applause, the quiet respect in the room told him that the message had landed. The fight for accountability hadn't ended with the court case. It had just begun, and Robert had made sure it would continue, quietly, but with unwavering strength.